Hi, I'm Andrew Connell with Critical Path Training, and in this session we're going to talk about the large list support that we have in SharePoint 2010 as part of the Designing Lists and Schemas module. So Microsoft has done has paid some attention and addressed some of the concerns that people had with large lists in SharePoint. Many people are familiar with this 2000 number that keeps floating up. Essentially, the problem is not so much, or the challenge that we have is not so much the fact that SharePoint lists can store vast amounts of data, well in excess of 2,000. We can store hundreds of thousands, if not millions of items inside of lists. The challenge has always been to pull the data back out, because some of the queries you would pull back, like if it had more than 2,000 items in it, the queries that are going to run turn into be very inefficient when you're pulling back lots of data, and it can cause the server to be overtaxed in trying to pull that data out. And so the large list support is not so much a developer thing, it's more a tool that's been given to the IT pros to kind of put some boundaries around to make sure that developers aren't writing queries, or there's not something on the server, something going on in the different SharePoint sites that's overly taxing a SharePoint site in the web front ends due to the fact that there's a lot of content in a list. So developers need to be aware of how some of these things work so that we can go through and make certain considerations in our code. So some of the investments that were done here was mainly just to go through and to say that I'm going to have a new flag here that's going to essentially say what constitutes a large list that has a certain number of items in them. Once my list reaches that certain threshold, then this throttling is going to automatically kick in, which I can override, but that my throttling is going to kick in and it's going to keep me from pulling back lots of data in SharePoint queries that could potentially hurt my server. So these settings are all going to be configured at the web application level, and a lot of the settings, if I want to change some of the values here, I'm going to have to do this stuff inside of PowerShell. So what are these different settings? So what happens here is that there's two thresholds. There's a warning threshold, and then there's the actual throttling threshold. So what happens is that when a query is run, or when a list has a certain amount of data in it, so the warning threshold out of the box is, I believe, about 3,000 items. But then the upper threshold, the throttling threshold, is 5,000 items. So when a list gets to have 5,000 or more items, then it's now considered a list that's being throttled. Okay, and this is a property you can check inside inside with PowerShell or through the object model. What's going to happen is that if a list is under that upper limit of 5,000, which that's a number that is configurable, you can change that through PowerShell. Again, when you change it, you're changing it for an entire web application, so you would find this property on the SP web application. I'll show you how to do this in PowerShell in a few minutes. But what's going to happen is that if the amount of data is under 5,000, then the list is not being throttled, so I can pull back as much data as I want, because it's going to be somewhere, it's going to be 5,000 or less. My query is going to have 5,000 or less items in it, with or without a where clause. So it's not really going to have an issue. However, if the list has more than 5,000 items, then the list is being throttled. So what that means is that if I issue a query that's going to pull back, say, 400 items, it's going to run like we've always seen. Nothing's going to change. If it pulls back 3,000 items, no problem. Everything's going to run just fine, because I'm still not pulling above that 5,000 limit, right? The 5,000 limit, again, the 5,000 limit is what told SharePoint this list should now be throttled, but it's also going to tell SharePoint that when it runs a query, that when it goes to start pulling data back, SharePoint will start trying to pull that data back out of the content database, but the second he hits that upper limit of 5,000, the query is going to throw an exception and say, I can't pull back any more data, it's an expensive query. Even if that query was only going to pull back 5,001 items, when it gets to 5,000, that's where it's going to stop. So in a nutshell, SharePoint, for throttled lists that have more than 5,000 items in them, SharePoint's going to try and pull that amount of data back, right? It's going to try and pull that amount of data, but once it gets to what that threshold is, it's just going to stop and say, I'm sorry, you can't do this. There's a window when these queries cannot be run, and this is going to be set in central administration. So I can say that between the hours of 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. in normal business hours, expensive queries are not allowed. But somebody could go in and run a query like in the middle of the night. They could schedule some sort of a query with their own custom code and say that I want to go through and run this query. I know it's an expensive operation, but I want to do it outside of what that protected window is, because taxing the server at 2 o'clock in the morning is acceptable because not many people are on it. So I can set up when those windows are. Now, when the code runs, you have these two limits here. So one limit is going to say what constitutes a large list, and that's going to be 5,000 out of the box. But for super users or for people who have the appropriate permissions, like an administrator, when they run the same code that a traditional user is going to run, then they're going to have a much higher limit that they can pull back because they're supposed to know what's going on here. And so out of the box, the super user can pull up to 20,000 items before their queries are going to be cut. Okay? So this is just, again, just kind of reiterating that we're going to pull back the lists are going to, when a list meets certain criteria, specifically when it gets over that upper limit, that's when the throttling is going to kick in. Throttling you can always check and see on the list itself. And again, I'll show you how to find this inside of PowerShell. Some of the other support here that we have for querying large lists is that inside of my query object, inside of my SP query that I'm going to run, I do have a property, a Boolean property that I can set where I can request a throttle override, which basically is saying, even if the list is being throttled, which I can check in code before I run an expensive query, I can also say, well, ignore the throttling and just run the query anyway. So just like that run with elevated privileges that we have, this is one of those things that you want to look for in your code reviews to see if a new custom component you're deploying is basically mitigating this whole new command and control factor to kind of maintain the health of your web front ends. And if a developer just said, well, forget about that thing, I'm going to have expensive queries anyway, the IT pros can still look at this and say, nah, the code's not so good there. I don't want you going through and overriding the throttling there. Okay? So you can change that kind of stuff if you want. Some of the other throttling that we have here is that Microsoft has introduced some wide list throttling, so I can only have a certain amount of data inside of a list. And this doesn't include the documents or attachments, but essentially that now the list items are limited to only be as big as have 8K of data inside of them. That's one limit that we have. That's a hard limit that we have. Another thing that we have is that we can only have a certain number of projected fields inside of our SharePoint joins. So we talked about joins in another session, but I showed you how we could do projected fields. Now, I can pick up to 6 fields that I want to project from one list into another one in my custom queries that I'm writing. But if I define 7 or 8 or anything more than 6 projected fields, SharePoint's going to throw an exception and say I can't pull any more fields because it's somewhat of an expensive operation to pull that stuff back. If I don't define what fields I want to pull back in the view fields, and I essentially do the equivalent of a select star, then SharePoint will pull the first 6 projected fields that are defined and not just and ignore all the rest of them. Okay, so it's going to pull either the first 6 that are defined, or if I explicitly state it and I put a list of a bunch of them, it's going to go through and just say, sorry, it's going to throw an exception. You can only have 6, no more than 6. Now, some of the other things that we have here inside the large list is that we now have the ability to mark a column as a unique column. So what that would do is that's going to ensure and put a new rule in place that says that you can't create another list item that has the same content in that column as another item in the list. So how does this work? If I go into a brand new list and I create a new column and I say I want this to be a unique column, SharePoint's immediately going to ask me, do you want to go through and set up an index for this column? You have to say yes if you want to go through and make this a unique column because indexed columns unique columns have to be indexed. So if you say no, it's just not going to create the column for you. It's just going to take you back to the creation page and let you uncheck the fact that you want to make it unique. But what happens if I want to do this on a new column, or sorry, on an existing column? Well, what's going to happen is that when I go into an existing column and I check to say I want this to be a unique column, SharePoint's going to go through and create the index, but then it's going to check to see, or before it creates the index, it's going to look at all the content in the list for that column, and it's going to see if there's any duplicates. And if there are, it's going to throw a little error, and it's going to say, sorry, I can't do this. You're going to have to clean up what these duplicates are before you go through and mark him as a unique column. But this is a nice new feature that we can go through and take advantage of inside of SharePoint 2010 here. What constitutes a column as being unique, or what constitutes the data as being unique in a column? It all depends on how your SQL Server has been installed and configured. It's all based on the collation that you set up when you installed SQL, or on the collation of the database. So now let's take a look at how we can work with large lists and what the unique columns look like. So in this demo, we're going to look at some of the large list support and throttling that we have inside of SharePoint and how developers are going to interact with this, and then also what the PowerShell interface and the end user experience is going to be. So what I have here is a list called LargeList that has 6,000 items in it. So when you go to a traditional list, like if we go back to our employees list and I look at the settings for this list, you'd see a familiar page that you've seen in the previous version of SharePoint, where it's just the standard list settings. But if I go back and look at this large list here, and I look at his settings, he now has 6,000 items in them. And I said that throttling was going to kick in at 5,000 items. What you can see here is that underneath the description of the list, you can see where there's this new list view threshold, which is telling me right here that I've got 6,000 items in the list, and the view threshold is 5,000 items. Now, when the list had more than what the warning was, this was like a little bar that shows up, and a little bar graph that shows up, and we get to a point where it says, you have 3,500 items in here, you're not being throttled, but I'm just going to let you know that you're past the warning level, so I just want to give you a bit of a heads up here. You may end up having, this list has got to, potentially could be throttled sometime in the near future if it keeps getting data in it like it looks like it is. So this list is now considered a throttled list here. So if I come over and take a look at the code, what's going to happen? Well, this is just a standard console application. And now this console application is going to work because I'm logged in as the administrator, so my upper limit is way in excess of 5,000. So in this case here, what's going to happen is I've gotten a reference to my large list. I've gotten a reference to my large list here, and then if I was logged in as a regular user here, this operation right here is going to throw an exception. And it's going to say that I'm not allowed to do this because it's a large list and I'm inside of that service window where the server is being protected. However, if I had the appropriate permissions, I could run some code here that says, I want to go and enable throttling. Well, first you can always go through and you can check to see, does the item, is it being throttled? So I could always go through and do a quick little check of large list, and then do the check for, is throttled. This is just going to tell me, is the list being throttled or not? And that's telling me that it's over the 5,000. You don't want to do a check to see, does the list contain more than 5,000 items? Because you really don't know what the setting is for the web application. It may be more, it may be less. So I can also come in here and I can make a change to the list to say, should throttling be turned on or off of this list? Maybe there's a reason why I want the throttling off of a very large list. Don't know, but we have that option here. This is the part where I was saying where for these kinds of things that you're doing in code, nothing substitutes a good code review. Same thing with run with elevated privileges. So this code would then go ahead and run. So if I was logged in as a regular user, this would fail, but this would end up running. So the other thing I wanted to show you briefly here is I want to show you what the PowerShell experience looks like. So I'm going to come over here. The different settings, I guess, what we're going to show you is the settings that you can set on a web application to find out what the upper and lower limits are and stuff, and what the warning threshold is. So I'm first going to go through and get a reference to my site collection using the new PowerShell commandlet of get sp site and pass in the URL of our site. Now, remember, these settings are not at the site collection level. These settings are at a much higher level, at the web application level. So I want to go through and look at the site collection, look at his web application, and look at a couple properties on this. Now, you can always get all the properties if I just go through and pipe this and say, select star, and it'll dump everything here. But we don't want everything. We want to find specific things. So I'm going to come over here, and we'll look at the same thing, except I'm going to say, let's look at a property called max items per throttled operation. Well, we can have up to 5,000 items in a throttled operation. So we now have a thing that says, how far can we actually go with this? What's our upper limit? I can also go through and even do a check to see what the warning threshold, what the override is. So I can go, if my super users can go through and then they can pull data up to 20,000. Right? If it's in excess of 20,000, they can't go higher than that. Right? So the next thing that we have here, another one of the properties I want to show is, do I want to allow OM code throttling override settings? So am I going to actually allow people to go through and say that I want to request a throttling override, the property I was talking about earlier, or my query that I was going to run? Do I want to give people the ability to turn off throttling before they run the query? There is a property on the web app that lets me say, no, you can't do that. So even if I didn't do my code review, or I've got a custom component that I can't see the source to, then I can go through and check and do that one little check there. And then again, you can always check the list itself. You can always do a check on the list itself by going through and saying, look at the list, large list, and checking out is pull back a little bit more data than we were looking for though. But the property I was looking for here is throttled right here. And we can see that it is throttled. Our list is now being throttled. Okay, so the IntelliSense wasn't picking it up there in PowerShell, but that's okay. We showed you that you can see now where the list actually does have this property of, is it being throttled? So that's the support that we have for large lists inside of SharePoint now.